we are very excited to be talking about Zodiac, a really great film and a great experience. Not exactly a short film, but a really great film. And with us to talk about it is Kip Mooney. And Kip, let me read the description we have for you on. It says Kip Mooney is a pop culture junkie and a die-hard Dallas Mavericks fan, and the Mavericks played really well last
Right.
night. With an unquestionable passion for film, a healthy appetite for politics, and a keen interest in religion, he's been writing for Central Track since 2014. He cares about all things Dallas except the Cowboys. So, my first question is, what's the matter with the Cowboys?
I mean, you can only put up with disappointment for so long. I mean, at a certain point, you just have to say enough's enough, and I'll watch something else.
And it certainly is a good time to be a Mavericks fan. They certainly are very interesting and fascinating. So the other thing is, so aside from writing about film, what are the other things that you do?
Well, so my day job is I'm an editor for Turner Broadcasting, which is now folded into Warner Media and AT&T and all that. But I work as an editor in the legal department and been doing that since 2017.
So Kip, what does that mean to be an editor in the legal department?
Right. So my full title, I guess, is Commercial Clearance Standards Editor. So basically,
Say that again. Commercial
Clearance
store
Standards
Standards
Editor.
editor. Okay, so
Yes. So basically, everyone on my team, what we're responsible for is watching all of the third-party advertising that comes in and reviewing it for content and, sort of just kind of the product category. Is this something we even want to be associated with putting on our air before those ads, get inserted into the breaks in between Friends or the NBA on TNT, whatever you're watching.
So
I watch
if you
ads
don't like the ad, it goes.
Yes.
There's some ads I would love to kill, I tell you.
Yes.
Such power you have over your life. So what did you do before you were a film critic?
Well, so I mean, I guess I've been a film critic, in an amateur capacity and a professional capacity for a long time now. So when I went to college at the University of North Texas, I was a reporter, but for most of my time there, I was the editor of kind of the arts section and the entertainment section, and wrote movie reviews, all throughout that time. And then after college, but I worked a lot of different places. I worked at a record store after college. I worked for Wells Fargo for.
Hey man, doesn't everybody have to work at a record store who's cool? I mean, if you're not, haven't worked at a record store, like who are you? Yeah.
Yeah, but I worked in the banking industry for a little bit, worked at Wells Fargo for probably 3 or 4 years and USAA for about a year. And then in 2017, my wife and I moved to Atlanta for her job. And then that's where I got involved with Turner Broadcasting.
So as a film critic, who are both the filmmakers you love and who are the critics that you were inspired by?
So critically, I mean, Roger Ebert is definitely the person that I, admired the most, whose writing style I enjoyed reading the most. I remember even in, middle and high school when Ebert and Roper were still on at odd hours on whatever local channel. Yes. Would watch them just about every week to, see the thumbs up and the thumbs down. The filmmaker I think that got me the most into film is definitely Alfred Hitchcock. When I was, I guess, 11 or 12, my parents took my sister and me to the Inwood to see Rear Window. And that kind of just opened up my world. And so, before then, I liked the Disney movies and Star Wars, but seeing Rear Window for the first time on the big screen was really what made me fall in love with movies.
So let's talk about Fincher. What is the first film of his that you saw?
I think it was probably 7,
Hmm.
which I saw as a teenager with my dad and my uncle. And my uncle had seen it before, but my dad and I had not. And so the scene where there is the discovery of the sloth victim, where you assume that the guy is dead, but he's really not, and kind of comes back to life. My uncle said that he just watched my dad and me, leap out of our chairs and do all that. But that was just such an interesting, weird, dark movie with just, I mean, for a movie with big movie stars like Brad Pitt and Morgan Freeman, it has a really downer ending, which is very unusual, for movies that they're in for the most part. And so after that, I was just like, I wanted to see everything.
So did you go back and look at like all the music videos? And because Fincher's such an interesting character, because most people who direct features started in features or started in shorts and then grew to features, but he really cut his chops in commercials and music videos.
Yeah.
And
I mean, obviously, Madonna's Vogue is kind of one of the most iconic videos, and most people
yeah,
don't know that he directed that. But he really is one of the really great music video artists, because he didn't work with necessarily the hippest bands, but he would work with the big stars, but do something much more creative, especially compared to just the very standard music videos at the time.
yeah. So I don't know if you know this, but back in the 80s, I was a music video critic for the Dallas Morning News.
Oh wow.
So I had to like come up with language about how to talk about music videos.
Mm-hmm.
I used to be a VJ at a club that showed music videos
Nice.
called On the Air and the Video Bar. I don't know if anybody remembers those institutions where many people got drunk and watched music videos all night. But it's the thing about having this sort of background in commercial media, music videos, and commercials is that he really knows how to use the camera effectively, and because in a music video you have to sort of, if you're not very interesting, people will lose interest after a little while. So you have to be very creative in all the lighting and camera angles and all the different ways that you have to think about setting a scene, and that you don't get characters telling you their story. The
Right.
story has to come visually. And so sometimes when people come from music videos and go into narrative filmmaking, they have to learn how to build like story, but you never have a problem with that in his films. His films are very, very meticulously plotted out. So he has kind of like this storytelling visually from that background, and the sort of commitment to story on the other hand that I think is very powerful.
Yeah. I mean, even in the opening credits of Zodiac, I mean, you have, or I guess after the first initial attack, the opening credits where it's just that letter is kind of menacingly on top of the mail cart and just moving through
Yeah.
the newsroom. But it's really setting up all of that. So, I mean, yeah, he's really great at conveying information without, overly explaining everything.
Yeah, I mean, and the thing is that the when you start out early on with that thing with the letter, following the letter, to me, films like that, and Hitchcock is like this, and a lot of the great visual storytelling directors are like that. It's like at the very beginning, he's saying, "Look at this." And you're going to pay attention. You're going to pay attention to what the visuals look like. You can't just sit there and just listen to it and kind of fall asleep and not pay attention. And so your eyes at the very beginning are trained to sort of look for things. And I think that really changes how you look at film. And I think it's really kind of important. So what are the things that you like about this film?
Well, there's a lot, and so I watched it again, I guess, on Monday, and this is probably my 7th or 8th time to see the film. And the thing that really stuck out to me this time is how funny it is. And I mean, yeah, there's a lot of, really intense procedural stuff, and the attacks are terrifying, but there's just so much humor, and a lot of it does come from Robert Downey Jr. There's that great scene where he takes Jake Gyllenhaal's character out for drinks,
Mhm.
and Jake Gyllenhaal has ordered this very fruity beverage with a parasol, and he says, "Okay, what is that?" And he says, "Well, it's an aqua velva. You wouldn't you wouldn't make fun of it if you tried one." And then it immediately cuts to there's like 6 empties
Yeah.
on the table, and he's drunk. And then the very next scene, he talks about how he was a Boy Scout, and Robert Downey Jr. says, "Well, we weren't all Boy Scouts." And then he does some cocaine right at the table, and just kind of the banter that the two pairings have, Jake Gyllenhaal and Robert Downey Jr., and then you have Mark Ruffalo and Anthony Edwards, and they have their kind of rapport too, where they're always eating. Mark Ruffalo's always trying to score some food off him, and
Right, some animal crackers or something. I mean,
Mhm.
it's like, yeah, it definitely has that, the buddy kind of thing, kind of going on. And I wonder if is an aqua velva a real drink?
yeah, I don't know. It looks like a Sonic Ocean water with maybe some rum in it.
Yeah.
But I don't know.
So there's clear humor, but it's also, I mean, I think one of the things I like about the film is the way it's so meticulously constructed,
Mhm.
and it's this instead of it being a simply like who did it, it's like how people find out. It's about the investigation. It's about how people find out information and what that is. And I think that's a really fascinating way to sort of take this. I mean, it's not about the gore, but it's about trying to. It's in a sense, the minutia is king.
Mhm.
And you
Absolutely.
want to talk a little bit about that and some scenes that sort of reflect that from your perspective?
Yes. So I mean, really, I mean, it's almost a 3-hour movie, and really, it's 2 halves. It's the first half is the police investigating, and then the second half is Robert Graysmith trying to piece all of those different fragments of cases together to write his book, and then kind of filling in the gaps of what they missed. And so it is a lot of little details, and there's a great montage where Mark Ruffalo and Anthony Edwards are kind of reviewing all the information in their case, and then Jake Gyllenhaal and Robert Downey Jr. are reviewing the facts that they know, um, and just they kind of go over the same details over and over, but there's always something new that somebody missed, a little detail. And then Robert Downey Jr. introduces the idea that maybe this guy really didn't kill all these people. He just took credit because a lot of the details were already public knowledge. He just wanted the
Attention.
attention that came with it. And so you just learn a little bit more every time, and just the little things that are frustrating in the initial police investigations, and you kind of realize at the end, if they had all actually worked together and hadn't had the small towns had the kind of not rivalry, but just the distrust of the big city, San Francisco police department. If they had actually worked together, all the different departments, they probably could have caught this guy. But
That's
there's,
true.
yeah,
And all the stuff was paper and files. It wasn't
right,
like you could just send over a file on the internet to somebody and
exactly. There's no Dropbox. Well, and speaking of little details, one of the things that I love that I had never noticed before is there's a scene where Jake Gyllenhaal's watching the news on TV, and right above his TV is a big poster for Alfred Hitchcock's The Wrong Man. And I just thought like how great that is, because they're always kind of chasing these different leads, and each Paul Avery and the cops and Robert Graysmith, they all get fixated on these different guys who are not the right guys. And then you've also got all the people calling in saying, "I'm the Zodiac," or "I know the Zodiac," and they're just people looking for attention. So they keep following the wrong man. And I just I was like, what a great little, detail that's only on screen for maybe 5 seconds,
But it's also, clearly there's an influence from Hitchcock in that, in one sort of way. But then there's also, the sense of um, All the President's Men,
yes.
which is, I think very heavily influenced this film
Hmm.
in terms of trying to piece together what happened in Watergate. And the difference there is that that's about the press. And here we have the press. It starts with the press. I mean, the first people we get before we meet the cops, we have the letter.
Hmm.
I think that's correct. I may be wrong.
Yes.
So we're starting there, and then they're sort of doing their thing, and and then the cops are doing their thing, and they don't really mesh together well.
Mhm.
And I think maybe if they got along better all the way through, things might have been kind of different. And then speaking of movies, to me, one of the creepiest scenes is the guy where they go into the basement.
Oh yeah.
And it's like this little tangent that is extremely horrifying.
Oh yeah. And
Um,
yeah,
yeah.
no, I love that scene, and because the sound mix plays with you, because you hear the creaks in the
Oh,
floorboards and the pipes, and is there somebody else there? And the guy that he meets, seems nice, but then the more you learn about him, he's a little creepy. And then there's the great editing trick of, after he escapes from there, he goes home, and now his wife and his kids are gone. And
yeah.
now you start thinking, oh no, did somebody get him? Oh no, she just was tired of you, being obsessed with this case and not taking care of the kids and putting everyone's lives in danger. So she went to her mom's. So, I mean, it's just brilliant.
Yeah. And I love that, the relationship with his wife starts with on their first date, waiting to find out what happens. So it's like that's what initially attracts her. And then that's also what eventually makes her split, which I think fits
Um,
in that really nicely.
and that was a little detail that I loved, is both Paul Avery and Robert Graysmith, they get so obsessed with tracking down a lead for the case that they just kind of forget California geography. So like, he's like, oh, I'm going down to Riverside, which is like 6-7 hours away. And he was like, I don't think he realized how far that is. And then later on, she says, oh, are you taking the morning off work? He says, oh yeah, I'm just going to be gone for an hour. I'm going to Sacramento. And she says,
Right.
Sacramento is 2 hours away.
Right.
And just, they get, this just consumes their life so much as they forget, basic distances, even though they've lived in California for so long.
Well, sometimes it's about obsession. I mean, and so many films are about, certainly in a documentary film, you want a character who's obsessed rather than somebody who's not. They're not nearly as interesting. And pretty much all of the people connected to the film, their obsession pretty much changes and mostly destroys their life.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
then, yeah. And this coming from a filmmaker who is obsessed himself.
Yes. And those are the characters that he likes to make movies and shows about, are the people who are obsessed.
Indeed, indeed. So you want to talk about how obsessive he is in the pre-production and post-production? Fincher as a
Oh
director?
yeah. So I mean, in just reading some stuff about it, the script had been around for a while, and the studio wanted, a tighter movie, and they wanted, a little bit happier ending, or at least less ambiguous ending. And then
Wait, a
Fincher got,
happy ending to this story?
yeah, exactly. I don't know how that would work. But then, David Fincher got involved and was like, no, don't do any of that. But they did go back and rewrite it. And Fincher and the writer, they went back and interviewed some of these real people from that time who were still alive, and got their perspectives on it. And part of that attention to detail that shows up in the movie that I really love is that at each of the different attacks that they dramatize, they're all played by a different actor. And what they did is they used the police descriptions from those events,
Hmm.
and then cast somebody who, kind of matched those dimensions. So you really have no idea who the killer is I mean, they kind of point in the direction of one person later, but in those scenes, he's you either don't see his face,
Mhm.
or there's the scene where he's wearing the hood, and so you really just have no idea who the killer is, and it's not resolved at all.
Right, which is all the way through the film as well. It also means that when he's directing, that he knows so much because he personally went through and did the research.
Yes.
So actors do research on their characters and they try to know what they are. But when you have a director who is like obsessively gone through every detail of this case and knows the minutiae, it really is different. And then, of course, he's very famous for taking 50 takes of something,
Yes.
which
Yes,
is
there's an anecdote, and I believe it's for this movie, where Robert Downey Jr. got so tired of it that he would intentionally not bathe on the days he was supposed to show up to set, in an effort to try to get Fincher, or at least the crew, to be like, all right, let's wrap this up. Um,
right, right,
uh,
right. When they said this take stinks, they really meant it.
right, exactly. But I think it works for all of Fincher's movies. That kind of obsessive and repetitive nature. I don't think I'd want to be an actor on his set, but I mean, it usually works because most of the performances that he gets, in this movie and in all of his movies are really good. So maybe he's on something.
Yeah, and it's a long film, and he takes a lot of takes. I think I read someplace that it was like 150 days or 120
I
days
believe
or
it
something
for
like
sure.
that.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like a third of a year
Hmm.
to produce a film. I mean, how many people get that many days?
Yeah, no, and he really doesn't for the most part anymore, and so I think that's part of the reason he's turned to Netflix to finance some of his movies, is they're willing to give him the budget and the time to make these things that he's obsessed with.
And speaking of Netflix, I mean, he was involved in what's the name of that series? House of
Mindhunter.
Cards. House of
Which one?
Cards. House of
Oh
Cards.
yes, House of Cards. Mm-hmm.
Well, Siri thinks that's beyond her abilities. Um, so what's really, I think, interesting about that is that House of Cards really helped Netflix
Yeah,
get to be Netflix. I mean,
absolutely.
before then they were, mostly sending DVDs in the mail. And, now they are like the new Hollywood. They're
Yeah,
making material all the time. So he having somebody of his stature make something and then make something with multi episodes and multi years, and having, good actors and the good stories. I mean, until it went off the rails near the
yeah,
end. Um,
yeah.
I mean, for the first, I mean, it actually, I have to say, it would be really good, knowing what we've gone through in the last 4 years, to rewatch House of Cards
Yeah,
again
yeah.
and see, how crazy it really was. But that was really critical, and people really watched that, and it made a really significant cultural difference, because without that show, I don't think Netflix would be what it is now.
Definitely not. Yeah. I mean, yeah, it really was. I mean, now because of the controversy with some of the people involved, and because there's just so much content now, it's kind of almost been forgotten, but it really, really did, kind of change the world, at least in terms of culture and how we consume things. So, yeah.
Yeah, and what would this pandemic be without Netflix?
Oh man, I don't know. It'd be pretty rough. Yeah.
So what are other scenes, particularly watching it this time after maybe not seeing it for a year or so, kind of stuck out to you, aside from that scene with the Hitchcock poster?
Yeah. So I really love more of this time. I guess I focused a little more on the scenes with Mark Ruffalo and Anthony Edwards. I really love when you see them for the first time. They're investigating the crime scene where the cab driver's been shot,
Mhm.
and
They keep coming
uh,
back to that scene. I mean, I think more than any place else, And I think I read that had to be computer generated because that block didn't look like that anymore.
Right. It didn't look like that. And also because they did it on a set, you didn't have to worry about, it was a night shoot technically. So you didn't have to worry about running out of nighttime.
Yes.
But no, they did shoot that on a set. But yeah, just the way that they interact, and then him interviewing the kids, and then you find out that the cops passed by a guy who was the killer, but it didn't match the description, so they just let him walk by. But really the rapport between Anthony Edwards, who's just so good in this, and I wish he had been in more movies after this, because everybody knows him from ER, and he was in movies in the 80s, but he's so good in this, and I wish he had done some more movies. But I really love the way they interact, and they kind of ask the cop on the scene to stand in so that they can kind of visualize what would have happened, and just their interaction. They just have this kind of really intimate knowledge of one another that really make you connect to their characters really well. So I like that. And then I return to that scene, but also the characters. Mark Ruffalo drives back to that section every year that passes on that day, trying to see if he missed something or if he remembers something. And that's one of the great things about the movie, is just how it shows the passage of time, and then people forget about stuff, and then Robert Downey Jr.'s character makes the comment that more people die in the commute from Oakland to San Francisco every few months than this guy ever killed or even claimed to have killed, and maybe we're obsessed with him for no reason.
Well, mostly because we want to know the unknown. Mm-hmm. Which is, so you mentioned the thing about time, because this film, obviously, when you start the film not knowing anything about it, you don't think that it's going to be going over so many years, and it just, so every time that you go into time changes. And I think one of the techniques he uses to sort of signify the time is the music, which I think, to me, the music is like a major, for somebody who's a control freak, everything is important, but the choices of the pop music, I think, really sort of help signify change in time.
Yeah.
So you often don't have to say 3 years later. It's like you have a song that's 3 years later, and you kind of, and music helps you feel that time. It's like you hear a song and you remember what you were doing in those days, and how you felt about things. That I think is really kind of interesting.
Yeah, and it was a little bit personal for him, because he grew up in the Bay Area in the 60s and 70s, so at least remembers people talking about these things and remembers these songs. But I really love that montage where they're playing Marvin Gaye's Inner City Blues, and it's the montage of the Transamerica Tower being built, and that is kind of like the big changeover from San Francisco. Is just kind of it's a big city, but then it starts to become like, the hub of everything. And that just shows that's a much better way to do passage time than, they do have some title cards indicating, how many years later it is, but that's a great one. And then the director's cut, which the version that's streaming on Prime is the theatrical one, but the director's cut has this really fascinating spot in the middle where the screen goes black, and then they just have radio chatter and songs for about 5 minutes, but it's just a completely black screen for that whole time. And that is a really effective way of showing how much time's passing instead of just moving on.
Yeah, and I think I read that they sent that director's cut to the film critics, or for the Academy, I think, or something. Yeah, right. Which is something that you never do.
No. Yeah. Well, and it's a shame that, if they even watched, maybe they didn't want to watch a 3-hour movie, but didn't get nominated for a single Oscar, when there are numerous places it should have been nominated.
Well, that's a discussion for another day about what gets honors and what what doesn't. What other scenes really sort of stand out to you?
I really like the scene where Robert Graysmith goes to visit Paul Avery, who's now was kind of the star ace crime reporter at the San Francisco Chronicle, and now because of kind of his personal issues is now writing for the Sacramento Bee, which they even kind of joke about as the lesser paper in Northern California.
Yeah.
And so he now lives on a houseboat and just, I mean, looks so terrible. I mean, his beard's all grayed and his skin looks bad. And the whole time they're having this conversation, he has Pong on in the background, and it's just boop, 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 boop. And you know,
again, another reference that locks you into a time.
Yes.
You know,
yes,
definitely.
exactly. And you know, Robert's so excited. He's like, this is going to be great. He's going to have all his notes and clippings from when he was a reporter, and he can just give them to me and I can write this book. And he's like, he says, I lost them or I tossed them. He says, I don't know, man, I moved on to a boat. And just that, you know, he was hoping to be able to, you know, share his obsession, and just he's hits another dead end.
You know, every scene that Robert Downey Jr. is in just has a kind of energy to it.
Yes.
I mean, his face, just like there's a kind of, there's an insanity there, and a funny insanity that sort of is present in those moments.
Yeah, I think my favorite line in the movie is early on when they're not quite friends yet, but they've talked a few times at work, and he's, you know, trying to work on his story, and Robert's just sitting on his desk, and he just turns to me and goes, Jesus, Harold Christ on rubber crutches. Bobby, what are you doing? You're doing that thing we talked about. He's like, hovering? He's like, yeah, you're hovering. Get out of here.
And just think, how many times did he have to do that? How many
I know, right?
Did he get to say those lines exactly that way? Also, this film was shot on mostly digitally as opposed to shooting on film, with the exception of the slow motion material. Yeah. And when you're looking at the film, it looks really good. I mean, back in those days, that was not something that people did very much.
Yeah, no, he's been a huge advocate for digital shooting, and I'm sure, at least for maybe the camera operator, it's easier to do those 50, 60, 100 takes when you don't have to constantly be reloading a canister of film. But yeah, he's a, you know, a person who adopts technology and makes sure that it works really well. And so I think he's shot all of his films since then, all of his projects on digital.
Yeah. And I think part of that also is coming from that commercial and music video background, where, I mean, the early day music videos were all shot on film. I mean, there was a time when they had to be, but, you know, that long since, I think they went into digital like relatively early on. What else? What are the other scenes? What are the other actors that you really like? I mean, we didn't talk about Jake that much. And I mean, the performances in this are all just, the casting is just really amazing.
Oh, it's perfect. Yeah, whoever the casting director was on this movie just did a phenomenal job. And of course, I think the performance that stands out the most is John Carroll Lynch as Arthur Lee Allen, who they kind of view as the prime suspect. I mean, that interview scene where they interview him at his office, and he just keeps offering up freely all these little tidbits that make them suspect him even more. And whether he's doing that intentionally or just to toy with them, or just is that oblivious and, you know, doesn't think he'd ever get caught if he is indeed, you know, the Zodiac, is just crazy, because you've got the details of he's wearing a Zodiac watch, and he was, you know, at the lake around the time those people were murdered. And then he just, you know, kind of offers up, oh, I had some bloody knives in my truck, but that was from a chicken I killed for dinner. So, you know, don't worry about that. And then he says, oh, my neighbor saw me, you know, when I came back, but he died a week later. And, you know, just kind of lets that hang in the air about, did he kill him? Did this guy just die of natural causes? And
but it's also that performance that he's just kind of like stone cold, and it not emotive. I mean, his main emotive and the whole thing is like, you guys are bothering me, but I'll tell
Exactly.
you
Yeah.
a few things. And it's all in his face and in his delivery
Hmm.
that is really kind of haunting. And then the other sort of major scene with him is in the Ace Hardware store,
Hmm.
which is also, like just a great scene.
Yeah, and he doesn't even really say anything. I think he says, "Can I help you?"
Yeah.
And he sees who it is, and then just seeing his face change, while they just kind of stare each other down is just so good. Yeah.
So as you were watching it the first time,
Mhm.
who did you think killed? Who do you think the killer was?
Oh, I think the first time was definitely. I mean, the first time I saw it, I was like, "Oh, it has to be Arthur Lee Allen."
Yeah.
Um,
Even though the handwriting,
exactly. The handwriting doesn't
the
match, and
handwriting.
yeah, and I love that they trust him the whole time they're doing the initial investigation, and then afterwards they just basically discredit everything that the handwriting guy said, because they're like, oh yeah, he drinks as much as Paul Avery now. um but
But indeed, that threw them off more than anything else.
yeah,
It was the number one like problem with it.
yeah. Well, it's interesting, like you watch some of these true crime documentaries where they say, oh, we got a conviction off bite mark evidence, and yet like that's like a completely discredited thing now.
Yeah.
Is this, and how many people did got away with it or were wrong, wrongly convicted because they focused on this one little detail when all the evidence pointed the other way. But yeah, I also love just this is a little more sinister, but I love the attention to detail when they finally get the warrant to go look at Arthur's trailer,
Hmm.
and just all the little details about the squirrels
The
running loose in
squirrel.
his trailer. And then he
It's like
opens
it
up the
wasn't
freezer.
crazy enough. You
Right,
had to have
exactly.
squirrels there.
Yeah, he has squirrels running loose through his trailer. And then I forget which cop, but one of them opens the freezer. He goes, ah, and he goes, what is it? And he goes, squirrels. Just all those little details, and just like all of the weird kind of adult magazines he has, and just kind of his weird all the stuff, like someone put all those props there, and really just all those little details added up to make this guy, even if he wasn't the killer, he is certainly someone that you would want to keep an eye on.
Well, it's clear, I think, that maybe we're supposed to early on think that of course he is.
Yeah.
Certainly in that interview scene, it's
Mhm.
hard to sit through that scene and not really believe. And then they're all sort of like going in a lot of other directions. So in the film, we sort of hit about this earlier, that there's the cops and then there's the press. And it seems to me that the cops should have the upper hand because they have access to more things, but that's
Right.
not necessarily the case here.
Mhm.
And it's really kind of, I think that's one of the things he's perhaps pointing out, that
Yeah.
and again, being influenced by All the President's Men, which was like only done by the press,
Right.
that the press has a role, yet the press people essentially like left the case,
Yeah.
and it was left to the cartoonist to figure it out.
Right. And I mean, yeah, it was all because he noticed, if there hadn't been that cipher in that first letter, would he have even cared about this, or would have this just been another sort of, crime story that he didn't care about? But it was that cipher that really got him into, you know, the whole thing.
Because he's into puzzles.
Exactly. Exactly. Well, and they make that point again too, because they show the scene of, they have the CIA, they have the FBI, they have the Navy all working to try to crack this cipher, and nobody can get it. And then this woman,
Somebody's in Ohio or something.
yeah, she's reading the paper. Well, I love that this is another little detail I noticed. So they go through the thing, they go CIA headquarters, naval, research station or whatever, and then the next thing is breakfast nook of so and so, and that's where she is. She's reading the morning paper, and he says, "You want to take a stab at this?" She goes, "Yeah, I'll try it," and then she solves the first cipher. Yeah.
Yeah, and then there's also the whole thing about the movie reference.
Yeah.
And what's that about?
Well, and so I mean, the first Dirty Harry movie, they, you know, kind of incorporated some of the Zodiac killing mythology and story into the movie. And so there's that great edit where the chief of police, played by Dermot Mulroney, tells Mark Ruffalo's character, he goes, you know, take some time off, you know, go see a game, go to the movies. And then it cuts to the premiere of Dirty Harry. And, you know, they, Mark Ruffalo even references that later. He goes, you know, you have to do this by the book. You can't be Dirty Harry. You gotta base this on facts. You can't just assume that this is the guy and, you know, you're gonna nail him.
All right, so we have some questions here in the chat, which I have been ignoring, but we should go to them. Okay, so Gordon Smith first asked, and did you see Rear Window on a big screen? We were talking about Hitchcock.
Yes, so that when my parents took me to the Inwood, we saw Rear Window, and so my first time seeing that movie was on the big screen. So that was part of it too. I mean, you know, I've seen it countless times since then at home, but seeing it on the big screen was huge.
Yeah, and that film particularly, given that the sense of the claustrophobic sense of that room, and then the looking outside, and anybody who's lived in an apartment in New York City like knows about like looking at your neighbors and looking across the way. And of course, we should mention that every October the Angelica shows Hitchcock films on their Hitchtober, so I'm sure they'll be running that at some point. Raquel says, did you already talk about the fact that this was shot on digital? Yes, we did that. We just keep shooting, and Robert Downey had to insist on going to the bathroom. Yes, we didn't talk about the bathroom, but we certainly talked about him smelling. Yeah. And 2017 was a wild year for the Oscars. No Country for Old Men, There Will Be Blood, and that was tough competition.
Great year.
Yeah. It was interesting watching Gyllenhaal's obsession spiral through the stages of how messy his hair was.
Yeah.
And
his hair is usually pretty wild in movies, and the crazier it is, usually matches the craziness of his character.
So you have to have a good hairstylist on set as well as everything else. And then Gordon's asked, Fincher is something of an acquired taste. He finally got nominated for Benjamin Button and Social Network. And it's really, I mean, thinking about his career, I mean, this film is like, you know, this big whodunit, this big, like, what's going on. And it's obviously completely stylized in a way, but Benjamin Button is a completely different sort of stylistic story that plays with things in completely different ways.
Yeah, he really is. I mean, he has his obsessions and you know, his style, but you know, I don't really think any of his movies are really that similar. I mean, they have some common themes, but every movie is you know, completely different from the one that came before it. And he does, even though he is kind of a, you know, likes the weirder, darker stuff, he really has adapted, you know, some very popular mainstream things, but put his own spin on it. So he can do everything pretty much.
Yeah, and then in the Social Network, you know, working with Sorkin, I mean, working with dialogue that's a little bit different than, you know, that is just in a very different way, but that still is a sort of natural collaboration, I think worked really well. And, you know, given what's going on with Facebook now, watching and all social media, watching the Social Network would be kind of a good sense of how did we get here?
Yeah. I would absolutely love a sequel written by Sorkin and directed by Fincher of just how big Facebook became and kind of the, you know, calamitous effects it had on society, even though there are some good things, like we're able to do this conversation and people are able to watch it, which is great, but there are a lot of downsides to Facebook too.
So what else do you want to talk about here? Do we have any questions from anybody else? Any thoughts? Yes, Roseanne. You have to turn your microphone on.
I keep forgetting. You mentioned the basement scene
Yes.
and the hardware store scene. And both of those scenes really magnified the suspense and the freak factor by the close-up shots of of Jake's face,
Yeah.
Robert, uh, the character's face.
Mhm.
And throughout the whole film, there weren't too many shots like that that really, it's like you knew something really scary was going on because of the way the camera work and the editing was.
Yeah. So I think that he's very careful at, selecting as a visual storyteller of like finding the moment to use the close up and to really get in a sense of fear. I mean, those shots that and when people are calling his house, I think are the times when he's truly most afraid.
Mhm.
Yeah. Just so just thinking of all the congressmen who have to who are afraid of their constituents are getting those phone calls and feeling afraid. Don't know why I said that.
Close-up shots.
Things are going on in the world, as we know. So what is the legacy of this film? Has this film in and of itself influenced other films and other filmmakers?
I would say yes and no. I mean, I think at the time, it did not make a lot of money. It kind of famously came in second to Wild Hogs, which is a movie about Tim Allen starting a motorcycle club.
I have never seen that film.
Yeah, me neither. But I think, its reputation has definitely grown, over the past 13, 14 years. But I think more of the legacy is in the kind of cultural obsession with, true crime and unsolved murders. And I mean, I think, especially over the last, I guess, 10 years, that's just kind of exploded. And now there's, multiple TV networks devoted to just that. And you had podcasts and you had the one about the Golden State Killer, the book and the documentary series about that. And so that whole kind of obsession, especially in a way, I mean, I wouldn't necessarily call it nostalgia, because a lot of people who, are obsessed with this stuff, these are all things that happened before they were born. The whole kind of idea of serial killers, you've had countless shows and movies about it, but it's really in the everyday world, at least in the United States, it's not that common anymore. So there's that kind of mystery of what it was like back when this was a real fear of
Yeah.
the thought of the killer.
The nowadays, if you were making this now, it would be a 6-part series on Netflix.
Oh, of course. Yeah.
I mean, and now the length is not a problem. I mean, the length is an advantage. Raquel says that Fincher is not known for great women characters, but the females here are slightly more sane. What would you say about the roles of women in this film?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think the women characters are more complex, and I think part of that's the writing, and part of that's performances, because Chloe Sevigny and June Diane Raphael are both really good actresses. I mean, they are still kind of limited to just the wife role. They're not really involved in this, but at the same time, it's also a story based on, real events. So they unfortunately were not involved in, important roles of tracking the killer, writing the books about them. But yeah, I think that they have reduced roles, but they definitely have an impact on the characters, and not in the way that some of the characters in his films are a little more extreme and violent.
Yeah, but and just thinking about this, like the very first scene in the film, do you remember how the first scene is they go to the hamburger place and say, oh, too full, let's go over here where it's nice and quiet.
Right, exactly. And he keeps asking, is that your husband? Is that your husband?
And so so we get this trope of the aggressive woman sexualized woman gets killed, and she
Right.
is the first person who gets killed,
Yeah.
which
Yeah.
you often see that in horror films.
Right. Yes, exactly. Yeah. But so that's the interesting thing. One of the interesting things about the movie is, based on the facts of the case, the first two attacks that we see, it's a couple in an isolated place, and the woman dies, but the man does not.
Mhm.
And, they both come back later briefly to try to,
Yeah, to identify.
shed some light on what happened, but, they're messed up physically and, emotionally from having survived that.
Yes, I think that I would be messed up if I
Right.
was sitting in the car next to somebody and they
Yeah.
died that way.
Uh-huh. Yeah,
Don't
you know who we didn't talk about, who's also great in this movie, is Brian Cox, who plays the lawyer and
Oh, the lawyer, right?
actor who, he's the one on the morning show that
On the TV show.
Yeah, that the guy calls into, and it turns out, it's not even the killer. But he also has that great line where they propose a meeting and he says, "No, let's meet here." And so then every cop car and news van is headed right there. And
Yeah.
as soon as they get out, Brian Cox says, "You guys sure know how to put on a secret meeting."
And yeah, and then he's the one who, of course, the killer called in his phone and he just didn't think that would be important to anybody, or nobody
Exactly.
asked the person who picked up the phone and talked to him. And that clue about the birthday, it's like nobody thought to ask that question.
Mhm. Yeah.
But that's kind of stuff. Raquel also mentioned the sound design, which the sound, I think we talked about the music, and there is some music, but the sound design is also, I think, really great.
Yeah. Yeah.
And Roseanne, you have a question? You have your hand up.
Well, I do. Parts of the dialogue seemed dated, almost a little bit amateurish in a few places. And I really wondered, if that film were made now, how much differently do you think the script would have been written?
Well, I think from my point of view is I think he tried to write the dialogue from what was common dialect in the years that it was written in. I think so that, during whatever those years were, I mean, the kind of research that went into this film, I don't think that he would use vernacular that wasn't sort of common. That's my sense. Kip, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think that also he kind of tries to write for the characters, and some of the characters are a little more no nonsense, and some of them are a little more, not necessarily highfalutin, but they're more knowledgeable, and they kind of project that in the way that they talk. And so, I mean, I think that, some of it is maybe how it was. Maybe some of the people are a little more condescending. Some of the people really didn't know what they were talking about, and so they're when they're saying whatever they're saying in the scene, it's not. It maybe is a little more true to life, but it's not, doesn't flow as nicely as some other movie dialogue.
And Raquel says, why were there too much pressure on documentary look of the film by dating each scene by hours and time? Why is there too much pressure on documentary look of the film by dating each scene by hours and time?
That would be something I would love to ask David Fincher, because I'm curious if that was a studio note saying we've got to orient people to know
it's
what
now
year
1972, 12 years later.
Right. Or if that is something that he wanted to do to kind of stress like how much time passed in the initial investigation of the case, and then in the subsequent, kind of combining everything to write this book.
Yeah.
If he wanted to nail that home, or if that was something they were like, people aren't going to know what time it is or what year it is unless you put it on the screen. I don't know.
I'd be willing to bet that that's kind of a studio thing. I mean, if in his director cut, he had a black screen with some radio talking going along, I don't think going for the easiest way to get that information was necessarily the highest thing on his
Right.
priority list.
Yeah.
I think that he tries to give you a way to feel the time, which is what the music does. I think the music gives you that sense of feeling a sense of time in a very powerful way. But I think but I'm sure that was probably a concession, and an easy concession, right?
Yeah.
Like Snowskin, you don't have to read that if you don't want to. I mean, the way of having the building go up as a way of showing time, I mean, I think so. It clearly shows an intent for being more expressive with that thought.
Yeah.
So did you write about this film when you were, have you ever written a review of this?
No. So, I mean, this is, I guess, showing my age here, but this came out in spring of 2007. So I was still in high school. I mean, I was a senior in high school, but I was still in high school. But no, I remember I saw this in theaters with my dad. I remember correctly, I had just come from like a spring break ski trip, and come home, and we went and saw this, on a Saturday or something. But I remember loving it from the very beginning. So I've been in for a long time.
If you were going to write a review of this now, what would your lead be?
Ooh, that's tough. Oh man.
Because it's really, people who don't write about film don't understand that you have to you go to a screening and then you have to find words to say how you feel, which means you really watch a film in a different kind of way.
Yeah. I feel I really have not written as much over the last year just because, there haven't been screenings, so I feel like my writing's a little, maybe not dulled a little bit, but it's just not sharp as it used to be. Cause usually I could go to a screening and either, knock out the review that night or the next day. But, gosh, this is a little hard cause it's, I've seen this so many times now. It's just kind of all in my brain. But if I was writing it, I don't know what I'd say other than just that, Fincher kind of brings all of his obsessions and personal history into, this really expansive but detail obsessed hunt for one of the most elusive serial killers in history.
All right. So last question. So you said that you've watched this several times over the years. And I think that as we rewatch films, we see things differently in them because we've seen them before,
right?
But also we've grown. When you saw this film the first time, you were how old?
Let's see. I would have been 19, I think, 18 or 19.
And when you're 18 or 19, you certainly react to things of sex, and you're clearly at a different place in your life now than you were then. Right. How do you think that changes how you see the film and appreciate the film? Because you've seen it many times over these years.
Right. So, I mean, I think the first time, especially as someone who didn't know nearly as much about film as I do now, I was definitely blown away by the style, because Fincher's whatever, even in the movies that you may not like of his, all of them have incredible style. But I think this time, it's even though I've noticed a lot more humor in this most recent rewatch, I think I just noticed how kind of sad it is. I mean, obviously there's the tragedy of the victims of this killer, but also just kind of the sadness of how obsession with this case and trying to find resolution where there is none really destroys your life. And I mean, the two cops have a great relationship, and that partnership and probably that friendship dissolved because, one of them just couldn't handle the pressure of working, this case and all of the stuff that went with it. And then, the Mark Ruffalo's character, his cop, went through a period where he was kind of accused of, trying to revive the case by making some, kind of fraudulent claims and stuff. And then, obviously Robert Graysmith, his second marriage fell apart because he was so obsessed. And then, Paul Avery was on drugs and, on an oxygen machine for most of the rest of his life. And just, it really sad how, all these murders, which some of them may have not even been connected, people just got so obsessed with it and it really just drained their life force away.
Yeah. So what it seems to me in summation there is that when you're younger, the excitement of it is different than the reality when you have a wife and you were thinking of these things. What is lost in the obsession, while it was clearly there in the film, resonates deeper when you're sort of at a different stage in life. And I think
Yep.
that's we have one question here. It says the rhythm of film is so fast, it's fast paced. What happened in the many years that come to the pressure for this fast pace? I'm not exactly sure the question, but it's about the time. And I think we talked about that, didn't we?
We did, but I mean, I would also say, I know someone on the panel had mentioned before we started that it took them a few days to watch the movie because it is very long. But the thing that I love about the movie is it is so fast paced and so well made. And there are these moments of humor, and like the mystery is still engaging, even when you know where it's going. That's one of the reasons I've watched it so many times, and I can just kind of throw it on when I need something to watch, is because it's just so quick. It doesn't, at least to me, it does not feel like 2.5, 3 hours.
Indeed. And our hour has come. Kip, it's been so wonderful. First of all, wonderful to meet you. Thank you for coming here and hanging out with us. And it was thoroughly enjoyable. And we do this every week. And again, next week's film, City Hall, please watch it sooner than later because it will stop being available for free on the 19th. So go to kera.org, search for City Hall, and you can watch it for free.